Suicide. The war in Iraq never ended for Jonathan Michael Boucher. Not when he flew home from Baghdad, not when he moved to Saratoga Springs for a fresh start, and, especially, not when nighttime arrived. Tortured by what he saw as an 18-year-old Army private during the 2003 invasion and occupation, Boucher was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, and honorably discharged from the military less than 2 years later. On May 15, 3 days before his 24th birthday, the young veteran committed suicide in his apartment's bathroom, stunning friends and family. There was no note. Johnny Boucher joined the Army right after graduating from East Lyme High School in Connecticut in 2002 because he was emotionally moved by the September 11, 2001, terrorist attacks. He felt it was his duty to do what he could for America, his father, Stephen Boucher, 50, said. Shortly after enlisting, the 6'2" soldier deployed with the Wolfpack 1st Battalion, 41st Field Artillery, and fought his way north in Iraq. He landed with his unit at Baghdad International Airport and was responsible for helping guard it. The battalion earned a Presidential Unit Citation for exceptional bravery and heroism in the liberation of Baghdad. But it was during those early months of the war that Johnny Boucher had the evils of combat etched into his mind. The soldier was devastated by seeing a young Iraqi boy holding his dead father, who had been shot in the head. Later, near the airport, the soldier saw 4 good friends in his artillery battery killed in a vehicle accident minutes after one of them relieved him from duty, his father said. Boucher tried to rescue the soldiers. Their deaths and other things his son saw deeply impacted his soul after he returned because he was sensitive about family and very patriotic, Stephen Boucher said. But when the sun set, memories of combat and lost friends rose to the top, causing the former artilleryman severe nightmares. Sometimes he would curl up in a ball and weep, causing his parents to try to comfort him. At nighttime, he was just haunted, Stephen Boucher said. Haunted, I think, by war. Bitterness about the war had crept in, and the troubled former soldier started drinking to calm himself. Supported by a huge family he adored, Johnny Boucher recently got his own apartment on Franklin Street and appeared to be getting back on track. He seemed to be calm and enjoying life. But it was difficult to tell, and he was still fearful of sleep, his father said. They had plans for a hike, a birthday party, and attending his brother Jeffrey's graduation. Then, without warning, Johnny Boucher was gone. He hanged himself next to a Bible, his army uniform, and a garden statue of an angel, said his mother, who discovered him after he failed to show up to work for 2 days. Salmon spawn and then die, after an exhausting upstream swim to their breeding ground. Lemmings rush to the sea and drown. But only humans knowingly take their own lives. The actions of salmon and lemmings are instinctual responses that may even help their species survive in the long run. Only in the human act of suicide do beings act for the specific purpose of putting an end to their lives. Suicide has been recorded throughout history. The Old Testament described King Saul's suicide. There Saul took a sword and fell on it. The ancient Chinese, Greeks, and Romans also provided examples. In more recent times, 20th-century suicides by such celebrated individuals as writer Ernest Hemingway, actress Marilyn Monroe, and rock star Kurt Cobain both shocked and fascinated the public. Today, suicide is one of the leading causes of death in the world. By the time you finish reading this page and the next, someone in the United States will have killed himself or herself. In fact, at least 100 Americans will have taken their own lives by this time tomorrow. It has been estimated that 1 million people die by suicide each year, more than 38,000 in the United States alone. Around 25 million other people throughout the world, as many as 1 million in the United States, make unsuccessful attempts to kill themselves. Such attempts are called parasuicides. Actually, it is difficult to obtain accurate figures on suicide, and many investigators believe that estimates are often low. For one thing, suicide can be difficult to distinguish from unintentional drug overdoses, automobile crashes, drownings, and other accidents. Many apparent accidents are probably intentional. For another, since suicide is frowned on in our society, relatives and friends often refuse to acknowledge that loved ones have taken their own lives. Suicide is not officially classified as a mental disorder. Although DSM-5's framers have proposed that a category called suicidal behavior disorder be studied for possible inclusion in future revisions of DSM-5. People would qualify for this diagnosis if they have tried to kill themselves within the last 2 years. Regardless of whether suicidal acts themselves represent a distinct disorder, psychological dysfunctioning, a breakdown of coping skills, emotional turmoil. A distorted view of life usually plays a role in such acts. For example, Jonathan Boucher, the young combat veteran at the beginning of this chapter, had intense feelings of depression, developed a severe drinking problem, and displayed post-traumatic stress disorder. What is suicide? Not every self-inflicted death is a suicide. A man who crashes his car into a tree after falling asleep at the steering wheel is not trying to kill himself. Thus, Edwin Schneidman, a pioneer in this field, defined suicide as an intentioned death, a self-inflicted death in which one makes an intentional, direct, and conscious effort to end one's life. Intentioned deaths may take various forms. Consider the following examples. All three of these people intended to die, but their motives, concerns, and actions differed greatly. Dave was a successful man. By the age of 50, he had risen to the vice presidency of a small but profitable investment firm. He had a caring wife and 2 teenage sons who respected him. They lived in an upper-middle-class neighborhood, had a spacious house, and enjoyed a life of comfort. In August of his 50th year, everything changed. Dave was fired. Just like that. The economy had gone bad once again, the firm's profits were down, and the president wanted to try new, fresher investment strategies and marketing approaches. Dave had been old school. He didn't fully understand today's investors, didn't know how to reach out to them with web-based advertising, engage them online in the investment process, or give his firm a high-tech look. Dave's boss wanted to try a younger person. The experience of failure, loss, and emptiness was overwhelming for Dave. He looked for another position, but found only low-paying jobs for which he was overqualified. Each day as he looked for work, Dave became more depressed, anxious, and desperate. He thought of trying to start his own investment company or to be a consultant of some kind, but in the cold of night, he knew he was just fooling himself with such notions. He kept sinking, withdrew from others, and felt increasingly hopeless. 6 months after losing his job, Dave began to consider ending his life. The pain was too great, the humiliation unending. He hated the present and dreaded the future. Throughout February, he went back and forth. On some days, he was sure he wanted to die. On other days, an enjoyable evening or uplifting conversation might change his mind temporarily. On a Monday late in February, he heard about a job possibility, and the anticipation of the next day's interview seemed to lift his spirits. But Tuesday's interview did not go well. He knew there'd be no job offer. He went home, took a recently purchased gun from his locked desk drawer, and shot himself. Demain never truly recovered from his mother's death. He was only 7 years old and unprepared for such a loss. His father sent him to live with his grandparents for a time, to a new school with new kids and a new way of life. In Demain's mind, all these changes were for the worse. He missed the joy and laughter of the past. He missed his home, his father, and his friends. Most of all, he missed his mother. He did not really understand her death. His father said that she was in heaven now, at peace, happy. Demain's unhappiness and loneliness continued day after day, and he began to put things together in his own way. He believed he would be happy again if he could join his mother. He felt she was waiting for him to come to her. The thoughts seemed so right to him, they brought him comfort and hope. One evening, shortly after saying good night to his grandparents, Demain climbed out of bed, went up the stairs to the roof of their apartment house, and jumped to his death. In his mind, he was joining his mother in heaven. Taya and Noah had met on a speed date. On a lark, Taya and a friend had registered at the speed date event, figuring, what's the worst thing that can happen? On the night of the big event, Taya talked to dozens of guys, none of whom appealed to her except for Noah. He was quirky. He was witty. And he seemed as turned off by the whole speed date thing as she was. His was the only name that she put on her list. As it turned out, he also put her name down on his list, and a week later each of them received an email with contact information about the other. A flurry of email exchanges followed, and before long, they were going together. She marveled at her luck. She had beaten the odds. She had had a successful speed date experience. It was Taya's first serious relationship, it became her whole life. Thus she was truly shocked and devastated when, on the one-year anniversary of their speed date, Noah told her that he no longer loved her and was leaving her for someone else. As the weeks went by, Taya was filled with two competing feelings: depression and anger. Several times she texted or called Noah, begged him to reconsider, and pleaded for a chance to win him back. At the same time, she hated him for putting her through such misery. Taya's friends became more and more worried about her. At first they sympathized with her pain, assuming it would soon lift. But as time went on, her depression and anger worsened, and Taya began to act strangely. Always a bit of a drinker, she started to drink heavily and to mix her drinks with various kinds of drugs. One night Taya went into her bathroom, reached for a bottle of sleeping pills, and swallowed a handful of them. She wanted to make her pain go away, and she wanted Noah to know just how much pain he had caused her. She continued swallowing pill after pill, crying and swearing as she gulped them down. When she began to feel drowsy, she decided to call her close friend Deidre. She was not sure why she was calling, perhaps to say goodbye, to explain her actions, or to make sure that Noah was told, or perhaps to be talked out of it. Deidre pleaded and reasoned with her and tried to motivate her to live. Taya was trying to listen, but she became less and less coherent. Deidre hung up the phone and quickly called Taya's neighbor and the police. When reached by her neighbor, Taya was already in a coma. 7 hours later, while her friends and family waited for news in the hospital lounge, Taya died. While Taya seemed to have mixed feelings about her death, Dave was clear in his wish to die. Whereas Demain viewed death as a trip to heaven, Dave saw it as an end to his existence. Such differences can be important in efforts to understand and treat suicidal persons. Accordingly, Schneidman distinguished 4 kinds of people who intentionally end their lives: the death seeker, death initiator, death ignorer, and death darer. Death seekers clearly intend to end their lives at the time they attempt suicide. This singleness of purpose may last only a short time. It can change to confusion the very next hour or day, and then return again in short order. Dave, the middle-aged investment counselor, was a death seeker. He had many misgivings about suicide and was ambivalent about it for weeks. But on Tuesday night he was a death seeker, clear in his desire to die and acting in a manner that virtually guaranteed a fatal outcome. Death initiators also clearly intend to end their lives, but they act out of a belief that the process of death is already underway and that they are simply hastening the process. Some expect that they will die in a matter of days or weeks. Many suicides among the elderly and very sick fall into this category. Robust novelist Ernest Hemingway was profoundly concerned about his failing body as he approached his 62nd birthday, a concern that some observers believe was at the center of his suicide. Death ignorers do not believe that their self-inflicted death will mean the end of their existence. They believe they are trading their present lives for a better or happier existence. Many child suicides, like Demain's, fall into this category, as do those of adult believers in a hereafter who commit suicide to reach another form of life. In 1997, for example, the world was shocked to learn that 39 members of an unusual cult named Heaven's Gate had committed suicide at an expensive house outside San Diego. It turned out that these members had acted out of the belief that their deaths would free their spirits and enable them to ascend to a higher kingdom. Death darers experience mixed feelings or ambivalence about their intent to die, even at the moment of their attempt, and they show this ambivalence in the act itself. Although to some degree they wish to die, and they often do die, their risk-taking behavior does not guarantee death. The person who plays Russian roulette, that is, pulls the trigger of a revolver randomly loaded with one bullet, is a death darer. Taya might be considered a death darer. Although her unhappiness and anger were great, she was not sure that she wanted to die. Even while taking pills, she called her friend, reported her actions, and listened to her friend's pleas. When people play indirect, covert, partial, or unconscious roles in their own deaths, Schneidman classified them in a suicide-like category called subintentional deaths. Traditionally, clinicians have cited drug, alcohol, or tobacco use, promiscuous sexual behavior, recurrent physical fighting, and medication mismanagement as behaviors that may contribute to subintentional deaths. Obviously, these kinds of behaviors are dangerous in their own right. Moreover, researchers have found a correlation between regularly engaging in such behaviors and later attempts at suicide. In recent years, another behavioral pattern, self-injury or self-mutilation, has been added to this list, for example, cutting or burning oneself or banging one's head. Although this pattern is not officially classified as a mental disorder. The framers of DSM-5 have proposed that a category called non-suicidal self-injury be studied for possible inclusion in future revisions of DSM-5. People would qualify for this diagnosis if they intentionally injure themselves on 5 or more occasions over a 1-year period, without the conscious intent of killing themselves. Self-injurious behavior is more common than previously recognized, particularly among teenagers and young adults, and it may be on the increase. Although the pattern is not well understood, it appears that the behavior becomes addictive in nature. The pain brought on by self-injury seems to offer some relief from emotional suffering. The behavior serves as a temporary distraction from problems, and the scars that result may document the person's distress. More generally, self-injury may help a person deal with chronic feelings of emptiness, boredom, and identity confusion. Although self-injury and the other risky behaviors mentioned earlier may indeed represent an indirect attempt at suicide, the true intent behind them is unclear. How is suicide studied? Suicide researchers face a major obstacle: the people they study are no longer alive. How can investigators draw accurate conclusions about the intentions, feelings, and circumstances of those who can no longer explain their actions? Two research methods attempt to deal with this problem, each with only partial success. One strategy is retrospective analysis, a kind of psychological autopsy in which clinicians and researchers piece together data from the suicide victim's past. Relatives, friends, therapists, or physicians may remember past statements, conversations, and behaviors that shed light on a suicide. Retrospective information may also be provided by the suicide notes that some victims leave behind. However, such sources of information are not always available or reliable. Around half of all suicide victims have never been in psychotherapy, and less than 1/3 leave notes. Nor is retrospective information necessarily valid. A grieving, perhaps guilt-ridden relative or a distraught therapist may be incapable of objective recollections or simply reluctant to discuss an act that is so stigmatizing in our society. Because of these limitations, many researchers also use a second strategy studying people who survive their suicide attempts. It is estimated that there are 12 non-fatal suicide attempts for every fatal suicide. However, it may be that people who survive suicide attempts differ in important ways from those who do not. Many of them may not really have wanted to die, for example. Nevertheless, suicide researchers have found it useful to study survivors of suicide attempts. And this chapter shall consider those who attempt suicide and those who commit suicide as more or less alike. Patterns and statistics. Suicide happens within a larger social setting, and researchers have gathered many statistics regarding the social contexts in which such deaths take place. They have found, for example, that suicide rates vary from country to country. South Korea, Russia, Hungary, Germany, Austria, Finland, Denmark, China, and Japan have very high rates, more than 20 suicides annually per 100,000 persons. Conversely, Egypt, Mexico, Greece, and Spain have relatively low rates, fewer than 5 per 100,000. The United States and Canada fall in between, each with a suicide rate of 12.1 per 100,000 persons. England has a rate of 9 per 100,000. Religious affiliation and beliefs may help account for these national differences. For example, countries that are largely Catholic, Jewish, or Muslim tend to have low suicide rates. Perhaps in these countries, strict prohibitions against suicide or a strong religious tradition deter many people from committing suicide. Yet there are exceptions to this tentative rule. Austria, a largely Roman Catholic country, has one of the highest suicide rates in the world. Research is beginning to suggest that religious doctrine may not help prevent suicide as much as the degree of an individual's devoutness. Regardless of their particular persuasion, very religious people seem less likely to commit suicide. Similarly, it seems that people who have a greater reverence for life are less prone to consider or attempt self-destruction. The suicide rates of men and women also differ. 3 times as many women attempt suicide as men, yet men succeed at more than 4 times the rate of women. Around the world, 19 of every 100,000 men kill themselves each year. The suicide rate for women is 4 per 100,000. Although various explanations have been proposed for this gender difference, a popular one points to the different methods used by men and women. Men tend to use more violent methods, such as shooting, stabbing, or hanging themselves, whereas women use less violent methods, such as drug overdose. Guns are used in 56% of the male suicides in the United States, compared with 31% of the female suicides. Suicide is also related to social environment and marital status. In one study, around half of the individuals who had committed suicide were found to have no close personal friends, although they may be active on internet and social networks. Fewer still had close relationships with parents and other family members. In a related vein, research has revealed that divorced persons have a higher suicide rate than married or cohabitating individuals. Finally, in the United States at least, suicide rates seem to vary according to race. The overall suicide rate of white Americans is more than twice as high as that of African Americans, Hispanic Americans, and Asian Americans. A major exception to this pattern is the very high suicide rate of American Indians, which is at least 20% higher than that of white Americans. Although the extreme poverty of many American Indians may partly explain their high suicide rate, studies show that factors such as alcohol use, modeling, and the availability of guns may also play a role. In addition to differences across racial groups, researchers have found that suicide rates sometimes differ within groups. Among Hispanic Americans, for example, Puerto Ricans are significantly more likely to attempt suicide than any other Hispanic American group. Some of these statistics on suicide have been questioned. Analyses suggest, for example, that the actual rate of suicide may be 15% higher for African Americans and 6% higher for women than usually reported. People in these groups are more likely than others to use methods of suicide that can be mistaken for causes of accidental death, such as poisoning, drug overdose, single car crashes, and pedestrian accidents.